We're in chapter 2. We looked at the first 4 verses last week, but let's start today in verse 5. For neither at any time did we use flattering words, as you know, nor a cloak for covetousness, God is witness, nor did we seek glory from men, either from you or from others, when we might have made demands as apostles of Christ. But we were gentle among you, just as a nursing mother cherishes her own children, so affectionately longing for you, we were well pleased to impart to you not only the gospel of God, but also our own lives, because you have become dear to us. For you remember, brethren, our labor and toil, for laboring night and day, that we might not be a burden to any of you, we preach to you the gospel of God. And so that first section there, we didn't use flattering words, as you know, as a cloak for covetousness, God is witness. And as we look at Paul's vision, if you will, of his ministry, of his preaching, of what he felt like he should be as far as the purveyor of the gospel, if you will. We look at that, and he says we didn't do it with flattering words. We didn't do it with a cloak for covetousness. We didn't do it for the glory from men, and implied there in that sentence, from the glory, or for the glory from you, or from the glory of others. And so, basically what's Paul saying about this ministry? Why do you think he talked about that? Why do you think he was pointing this out to the church at Thessalonica?
It would seem that presumes that other people would have done it.
Okay. It presumes that other people would have done it differently, and that certainly could be the case. Anything else? Dave?
Yeah, I think all of us know those people who were trying to garner something from us with flattery. You know, when the term flattery is used, it is not a positive word. And I think Paul is saying, yeah, I never came to you with any kind of pretentiousness, but I didn't try to flatter you. I didn't try, Paul says there's no pretentiousness here, and you said there's no greed here. I don't have a hidden agenda. I'm not trying to get something some respect from you that I don't deserve,
Mhm.
you know, and that's, so, you know, I think that's the foundation behind using flattery.
Yeah.
You know, flattery is not a positive thing. When somebody responds, you flatter me, that is not a compliment.
Mhm. Okay. So and we talked about this a little bit last week, that Paul often had to defend his ministry, often had to defend his apostleship to those who were his enemies, those who were his detractors. And you can't help but wonder if maybe some of these were the charges that had been leveled against him by some of those who didn't like what he was doing, who didn't like the way he preached, or whatever the case may be, didn't like his authority that way. And so they accused him of these things. And Paul is defending himself and saying, we didn't do that. And you notice he said there in the text, God is witness. This is not just my words, but God can testify to this, that we haven't done any of this flattering word, a cloak for covetousness. On Facebook, so many times there are memes about the modern so-called health and wealth preachers that you see on television, or they have their own websites and all of that, and fly around the world in their Gulfstream jets and all of that. And there is a sentiment, and I think it's the right sentiment, that these people are preaching the gospel not for the sake of the gospel itself, but for their own personal growth. And again, I don't know their hearts, so I can't judge them at all in that. But if my ultimate goal was to preach the gospel so that it would make me wealthy, that puts a different light on what I would preach, don't you think? Because, I mean, fire and brimstone sermons. Granted, I don't preach fire and brimstone sermons like probably most of us grew up on. Some of those old-time preachers who just got after it and preached hard. Nothing wrong with that. Sometimes we need sermons like that. But you're not going to get wealthy preaching that, are you? Because you're going to be telling people things they don't want to hear. You know, you can't do that. You shouldn't do that. That's a sin. And you're sinning if you do that. People don't like to hear that. And so if you're going to do this so that I'm the center of the attention, and so that I'm going to make a lot of money on it, I'm going to have to adapt my message so that it comes across to you in a way that will inspire you to support me in that. Now, did Paul ever soft pedal the gospel? No. He didn't very, very forcefully. And Jesus himself didn't soft pedal his gospel as he preached it. And so this idea of a cloak for covetousness, I'm not doing this to get rich. And then he goes on to talk about the fact that he worked himself to make his own money so that he wouldn't be a burden to the church, so the church wouldn't have to support him in that. And that was a decision he made early on in his tent making, with his tent making skills. And he supported himself. Not that he didn't have the right to have that support, but that was the decision he made. Mike?
In his letter to the Philippians, I think it was, he talks about, if I'm not mistaken, how once again while he was at Thessalonica, you sent to my needs. Mm-hmm. And so he not only supported himself, but what he was lacking there, I think he got help from Philippi. Am I right?
Yeah. Paul did accept those things for the support of the church, but his primary source of living, I would say, was that working as the tent maker and trying his best to do that, again, along with Priscilla and Aquila. We know they were of the same trade. And so, again, there's that old saying, follow the money. You've heard that one, haven't you? Follow the money. Well, when you follow Paul's money, for the most part, It went back to his job, his role as a tent maker. It didn't come from necessarily wealthy benefactors, because when it comes from wealthy benefactors, what's the temptation there? What might be the way you would look at that? Cater to them. Yeah, I'm going to cater to them because they're paying me big bucks to do this, and so therefore I've got, again, back to that idea, I've got to preach the gospel that they want me to preach because of the money, and the gospel should never be preached in any way other than how God intended it to be preached. And that's I think what Paul is trying to say here as he discusses that. He said, we might have made demands as apostles of Christ. Did he have that right to do that? Yeah, he did. He had the right to say, okay, you're going to support me. This is the mission. In fact, you remember when Jesus sent his disciples out, he told them, don't take anything with you. You rely on the hospitality of those people that you're preaching to. And so that was kind of a different mindset, a different way to look at it. Flo?
You know, the first 2 weeks where we discussed this letter was Paul, the gain he wanted was for God's kingdom. Mm-hmm. He wanted gain for himself. And he gave him thanks for helping him and reaching out to Thessalonians. And but he also was not one to, yes, he didn't pull any punches. Mm-hmm. And you look at his 14 letters, but when he starts his letters, it's always encouragement. Yep. Peace and grace to you all. It's always encouragement. So, yeah, you can say fire, brimstone, okay, but sometimes that kind of message is very discouraging. At least to me it is. Mm-hmm. But you remember that person. Yeah. You remember that person because of his message, or because of the way he stood up in the pulpit and did fire and brimstone. So Paul was not that way. He was always encouraging. Mm-hmm. And if we go back to Philippi, the first 2 weeks he was flogged, thrown in prison for sending a message that there was a new king coming. Mm-hmm. So the biggest problem they had with him was not just his background, where he persecuted the Christians, but also now he's saying this Jesus is going to be the king. Mm-hmm. And they weren't about to accept that. Those are the unbelieving Jews. Mm-hmm. So Paul had a lot of issues and a lot of problems through his whole journeys as he taught the gospel and as he established church, but he always encouraged. Mm-hmm. And when we teach and preach, we've got to be able to encourage and deliver a message just like Jesus did. I mean, Jesus could have brought down 10,000 angels and squashed the world, and he didn't. Mm-hmm. So I think Paul took the same example from Jesus and taught that.
And just to add to that, if you have somebody who is encouraging, and then they preach something that's hard to hear. Peter said, and Paul, some of the things he says are hard to hear. Would you respond better to that, or the person who is never encouraging and just always in your face? Well, I think we all know which way that would go.
Well, sometimes in the church, in my experience has been that we hurt the church by afraid to step on people's toes. Mm-hmm. And so by not doing that, we allow some things to happen, teachers to come in, agendas to come in. So there's times when we have to say, well, this is it. Mm-hmm. You cannot do that. And we can still do it with love and compassion and also some kind of encouragement.
Sure. And I think that was part of Paul's success is his care for the church, his compassion for the church, his love of the church is obvious in his writings. As Flo pointed out, he begins every letter with those grace and peace to you. I hear good things about you, all those things he say. In fact, he shows some tender moments here in just the next few verses that we're going to talk about. So he said, I'm not doing it with flattering words. I'm not doing it with a cloak for covetousness. I'm not doing it for glory from you or for anybody else. And I could have made demands, but that's not what I'm going to do. But here, rather, we were gentle among you, cherished you, as a nursing mother cherishes her own children, affectionately longing for you. So there's that, shall we say, sweet side, the side where he was expressing his love for them. It's interesting there that that word gentle, it's only used twice in the New Testament, this particular form of the Greek word. Here in 2 Timothy chapter 2 and verse 24, the word cherish there is only used twice, here and in Ephesians 5 and verse 29. That word nurse, nursing mother, is used only here in the text of the Greek word that's there. And so Paul uses these specific words, and I don't know that the fact that it's only used once there, if that means any significance at all to the word itself, or if it's just happened to be the word he chose to use there. But we were gentle among you. And when you think of gentle, what do you think of? You know, a gentle person, what are they like? Kind. Giving.
Careful.
Huh?
Careful.
Careful. I told you this before, but I consider my dad to have been one of the most gentle men I ever knew. Gentle unless I was in trouble, and then it was altogether different. But I know after the boys were born, he would sit on the floor and watch them play. And they'd be, when they were little, they were all over him, crawling and doing this and that. And he was just present with them, and they felt comfortable around him. And he was just one of those gentle people that he never seemed to get mad, unless it was me as a teenager. And it was just, to me, he was the epitome of what being gentle was all about, and something that I think personally I've hopefully tried to be, and hopefully all of us try to be that way, in the sense that we just be good, just be gentle, just be patient, just be kind, and is the word that we're used there. We cherished you as a nursing mother cherishes her own children. That's kind of a special bond, isn't it, between mother and child? And so Paul's saying we want to have that same relationship with you. John?
You contrast this with the way you approach the Galatians. For example, I've already, or if anyone preaches to you another gospel in the Corinthian church, you adjust the style to that particular church and a congregation, and in this case, he was gentle with the Thessalonians, and maybe he needed to be, and that was appropriate for the kind of congregation and kind of people they have.
Sure, yeah. And the message should always be appropriate to the need of the audience. And again, the letter to Laodicea, what did they need? They needed to be shook up, didn't they? Because they were just kind of lollygagging along and not doing anything.
Wire brush.
Yeah, and they needed the wire brush rather than the cotton ball. But then Smyrna, and Philadelphia both get good reports because of the situation that's going on with them. And so that message is tailored. Not that the message changed, but how it's presented is tailored to the need of that particular church or individual. Go ahead, John.
Think of the way Paul approached Onesimus with Philemon, how he gently laid out his case, and don't forget this, and don't forget that. But he never kind of gave him the dope slap at any point. He was very gentle with him. Yeah, when he was writing about the slave, he could have just said, here's what you're going to do. And he had the apostolic authority behind him to do that, but he didn't do that. He put it in his friend's court and let his friend make that choice of how he did that. And as best we understand, that's what exactly happened. But I'm affectionately longing for you. So just again, that gentle tone, that obvious love he had for the church there, obvious tie that he had for them. Probably some have said that the church at Philippi was Paul's favorite church, and maybe it was. I don't know if we can make that call and say that for sure. But I think Paul loved all the churches, but some he probably had a greater affection for because of their interaction. Don't you have a church, perhaps, in your background that's really kind of special to you? Maybe you don't attend there anymore, obviously, but many of you have traveled a lot and been around and lived in different places and attended different churches, and so some of those churches, more than others, you probably have a special affection for. Kindness because of the people there, the circumstances, or whatever the case may be. And I think Paul had that too because he was human, and I don't think he could
could help not looking at one church with more attention and more affection than another because of the things that he experienced with them or as a result of them. So it's and I guess the trick here is, how can I help make this church my special church? What can I do to create that atmosphere that when people are here and then they leave, they always look back at Pikes Peak with longing and with affection? And, now with Facebook and TikTok and whatever else there are out there, Facebook's about the only thing I'm on. But you can keep up with people, and they'll respond to you back and have interaction with you about the church, even though they no longer live here, no longer members here. And I think that's an important thing for us to foster within any congregation. But since we're here, we do it here to make sure that this is a congregation people remember as being, gentle, cherishing, affectionate in our dealings with each other. And rather than a church, you've probably maybe been at churches where that wasn't the case, that it was a little more antagonistic, that there were issues and problems within the church that kind of left a bad taste in your mouth for that. And certainly that's not the way church should be remembered, or the church should be. And that's, again, what Paul's talking about here. We're gentle among you. We're cherishing you. We're affectionate, because that's what we want the church to be to each other and ultimately to those you're going to be preaching the gospel to. Dave?
When you look at the events of Acts 17, verses 1 through 9, when you kind of wonder. He was persecuted there by the Jews. I mean, they ran him out of town. And you kind of wonder, are those same Jews now part of the church, or is this a different, or what is the situation here? But the thing is, in other places, Paul is pretty severe. I mean, he talks about the Judaizers saying, may they emasculate themselves. I mean, he's not gentle at all with it, but you have to wonder. I mean, Paul is obviously answering accusations, but he's defending himself. He is not countering anything that those accusers of his are doing. So this is like a completely different approach from other letters that he's written and dealing with false teachers and false doctrines.
It's
unusual.
Yeah, it's, again, he tailored the message and the forcefulness of the message for the need, I suppose, of the circumstances that he was talking about or addressing within a church, whether it was in Philippi or Thessalonica or Rome or whatever. He tailored that message, again, tailored the tone of the message, not the message itself, because the message has always been the same, but the tone of that message for that. And again, here he obviously cares about the church at Thessalonica. And yeah, he had some difficulties there. As Dave pointed out, Acts 17, when he was there, lots of trouble for him, and had to deal with that. And that could have maybe soured him on the whole city, church included, but that didn't seem to affect him that way. He seems, again, using these words, he loved the church there and understood that there was the church, and then there were those people who were his detractors, people who were his enemies. And he did not mix and mingle the two together in that regard. And so that, I think that's an important thing to keep in mind. So affectionately longing for you, we were pleased to impart to you not only the gospel of God, but our own lives, because you had become dear to us. And again, affectionately longing, another word that's used only here, a Greek word used only here in this particular letter to the church at Thessalonica, but affectionately longing. And I like what he says there, because notice the wording there. We were well pleased, number one, to impart to you the gospel of God, but number two, because we also wanted to impart our own lives. Why is that significant for Paul's preaching, or anybody's preaching for that matter? Again, impart the gospel, that's the duty and job of all of us to do that. But what about this idea of imparting our own lives? What's the meaning of that? What's the significance of that? Dave?
Well, you had earlier talked about preachers who are in it for the money. It's become, I would think service for Christ is not it's not a decision where you're going to say, okay, here's the kind of work I want to do, and I want to be, my goal is to eventually become supervisor, my goal is to eventually become CEO of the company, well, becoming a preacher or becoming a servant, a minister is not that lookout. You're not looking to become the chief minister of the city of Colorado Springs. You're looking to do only what the Lord sent your way, and to do that. And that's what Paul is saying. It's not a career. It's a service.
Okay, it's a service. It's a service. Go ahead, Janelle.
If you kind of want something to really work, you put part of yourself into
Okay.
it, so you're investing yourself in this, and almost certainly, and here with the scripture, was certainly investing themselves in this group. I mean, he could have gone in and preached the gospel, and those who understood it would have understood it, but he went and stayed, and he was kind to them, and invested their lives in these people and got to know them, then the gospel took root.
Yeah, absolutely. And again, this idea of investing yourself in that. We generally have located preachers in our fellowship. They come and they live among you and interact with you and live in the same community, because there is, well, let's use this example, and I hope I say this correctly. You remember for a while Woodland Park was without a preacher, and so Grady and I would take turns going up and preaching for them on Sunday, so that they'd have somebody to preach for them. And there was, for me, a sense of getting to know the congregation, getting to know them better. That was, but there was also a sense that I think Grady would agree with me, that we both knew that's not where we were going to be preaching. We were filling in, we were helping them out, we were doing a service, and that's good. And yes, we got to know the people better and appreciated them better. But they knew that once we're done with that, we're headed back down to Colorado Springs and may not be back for 2 or 3 or 4 weeks. And so there's a difference there in being immersed in that community than just visiting that community once in a while. And I think that's what Paul is trying to say here. I invested our own lives in you. And you think about, how long was he at Ephesus? Was he there 3 years at Ephesus? What kind of relationship do you think he had with that church? And which I think is highlighted by the fact that on his way to Jerusalem before he's arrested, which church elders did he call for? Church at Ephesus. And so there was a special bond there because he had been among them and with them. And so I think that's an important aspect. When you get to know somebody and you know that they live what they preach and preach what they live and are involved in their lives and understand you and you understand them, it just makes for a more harmonious, I think, relationship there. Flo?
If I was going to rewrite that, I would just put the word inside my heart, share. And but also share our own lives.
Yeah.
Janelle's right. We're invested in that. Paul was invested wherever he was, for every church he was serving, spreading the gospel. And going back to your thoughts about which is your favorite congregation, he lived in the moment.
Yeah.
I think in our lives, whether it's secular or Christian lives, we got to live in the moment. Right now, to me, I speak, it's my church.
Mm-hmm.
It's my favorite church. Sure, there's been churches we live, serve, and enjoyed, and miss a lot of our friends. But right now, we're in the moment. I think in our lives, we got to be that way. When we do that, we're happier. If you come to Colorado Springs from someplace that you want a lot better, if you do what you can do and make the best out of it, that's when you happen.
Yeah.
That's when you become a family. And that's when you start sharing yourself and invest in yourself. Mm-hmm. And if you don't do that, you'll be unhappy no matter where you go.
Right.
Whether it's Hawaii or New Zealand, you're going to be unhappy if you don't make the best out of your life, whether it's in your secular life or in your Christian life.
Yeah, absolutely. And I know probably some of you who military backgrounds who had to move every 2, 3, 4, 5 years, whatever the case may be. You ran into that. Is okay, how do I immerse myself where I am right now and be a part of this family, even though I left a church that I loved and loved the people. But that's not where we are anymore. We're here. And so we invest ourselves in this body of believers in order to make it a favorite place for us. What can I do to make this a better church? And I think that should be all of our attitudes in dealing with this, in understanding how churches function and operate. Let's do the best we can for the congregation. And do it because we want to give our lives as a part of that. And we are invested in it with blood, sweat, and tears, maybe. That we have our fingerprints all over it, so to speak. And so you've got that investment of time and energy and spirit within that body of believers. And that, to me, that makes it more special, makes it more meaningful, if you will, than if I was just coming in and warming a pew on Sunday and that's all I ever did. And that's obviously not you people, or you wouldn't be here in Bible class this morning. But it's that involvement in the body that makes a difference, and I think that's part of what Paul's trying to say here. He wanted to be involved with them and to have that special relationship, and he was striving his best to do that. All right? Thoughts, comments, questions? Dave?
Yeah, we keep saying we, us. It's not only Paul, but it's Timothy and Sylvanus that are, it's almost, I kind of wonder if you got 3 of them working on this letter together, so you got more than just Paul involved in here. You got 2 other servants from the Lord who are also as well.
Yeah.
And I didn't have to realize that except I said, what is it we stuff? And then I went back up and said, Paul, Timothy, and Sylvanus to the church.
Right.
That's what
Yeah, and I think I sometimes get this in my mindset. I think about Paul's missionary journeys, and I think about them as Paul's missionary journeys. And yeah, they were his. He went on them. He led them. He was the focal point of that. But how many times do we find Paul alone in his ministry on those journeys? Rarely do we find him by himself. He's always with Timothy, Sylvanus, Barnabas, whomever he's traveling with, and probably others that aren't named. We finished Romans, and Tertius mentioned that he's the one who wrote that letter. Not that he wrote the letter as far as content goes, but he was the scribe that was writing all of that down. So there was this group of people around Paul. He wasn't just a lone wolf out there preaching the gospel. He had a team with him. And I think when you think about that, isn't that the scope of the work of the church? Again, Hebrews 10:25, don't forsake the assembling of yourselves together. Encourage one another. And so it's that group effort that makes it even more special than if just one person is doing all the work and getting all the credit. And sometimes we forget that Paul always had, probably not the right word, an entourage around him that was helping him preach the gospel. And that, I think, was an important aspect of the work that he was doing. John, grab first. You had a comment?
Yeah. Comment saying be the change you want to see.
Okay.
Even if it's not change, if there's something that you want to see, there's something that you see needs to be present in the Lord's body, be that.
Yeah. Sure, yeah. Be what you want it to be. If you say we need to be friendlier, where do you start? Kevin needs to be friendlier in that, if that's what my desired outcome is, or whatever the case may be. I prefer to do it this way, though. I want something done, so I get on the phone with the elders and say, you ought to do this. I don't do that, but isn't that the way sometimes we think? We want to, let's get the elders and preachers to do it. I want this done, so they need to do it. Whereas, if I've got an idea and the elders are on board with that idea, I could be the one to run with that and make the difference in that whatever it is that we're doing. And so it's not just looking at Paul and saying, okay, Paul, you got to do all the preaching and teaching. Timothy, we know, was a preacher. And Timothy taught and he preached and he did those things even though Paul was the higher up, if we can use that term, he was the one that's mentioned most prominently because he was an apostle. But still, those others who were around him preached and taught and supported that ministry and made it the success it was that Paul wouldn't have likely been able to do had it just been himself. And so this concept of more, the more the merrier, I think has merit, and the more people doing the work, the greater the outcome of that work's going to be. John, you had a comment.
I keep thinking of the verse of being poured out as a drink offering.
Yeah.
I haven't studied the Greek for poured, but also our own lives. It's like they had really poured themselves into this Thessalonican church and not maybe reserved a little bit because they're unsure of the doctrine being taught and what discipline they may need. It sounds as though I think they'd say all in modern speak with this congregation.
Yeah, I like that phrase, all in. They were, jump in with both feet. And I think that's an excellent way to be when it comes to working within the church,
Not only did they teach and preach, but they were living the gospel as well, and being examples for their teaching. And when you combine that living what you preach, then it's just double enforcement.
Sure. Yeah, the living it is reinforcing of the speaking of it. And it's, if I were to preach to you and say, I'll make up something silly, you should never drive a Ford. And I drive a Ford. There's a disconnect between the message and the actions, and that automatically makes people what? Suspicious, questioning what the case may be with you if you say one thing and do another. And so again, as Janelle said, all these people were living what they were preaching, and that added to the value of the gospel and the reception of the gospel to see that. And I can't help but wonder, we don't know what the city of Thessalonica was like, but I can't help but think that the conduct of the Christians in Thessalonica would have been a stark difference from the conduct of the rest of the city. I can't help but think that would be the case. And that people would see them and say, there's something different about those folks. And hopefully that difference would be something that would be appealing and draw them in and encourage them because of what they see. That these people are actually living what it is that they preach. And I think Paul, of course, is the epitome of all of that. All right? Other thoughts, comments? All right. For you remember, brethren, our labor and toil, for laboring night and day, that we might not be a burden to any of you. We preach to you the gospel of God. And again, this is just carrying on what we've already been talking about as far as Paul not taking the wealth that he could have from his preaching and insisted on that, but rather doing it for the love of the gospel and making his own way in that process. But I think one thing that I get out of this, and we'll have to quit because we're out of time, but it's a simple, Paul said, our labor and toil. Church work is hard work if it's done right, correct? It takes time, it takes energy, it takes devotion, it takes dedication. And it's not just something we do coming to church on Sunday morning, coming to worship on Sunday morning. But it's bigger than that. And when Paul says, I labored and I toiled, we know that he literally did that. Toiled in some very harsh and very unforgiving circumstances, whether it be physical circumstances or the people that he dealt with. He had to work hard. And that should be our mantra as well. We ought to be hard workers for the kingdom, because the kingdom deserves that kind of dedication and effort from us. And so many people need to hear the gospel. If we don't work hard at it, they're not going to hear, because nobody else is going to preach it to them unless we do that. All right, we're out of time, so let's quit right there and we'll pick up there, Lord willing, next Sunday morning.